It's an honor to be here, and it's an honor to be in the presence not only of the vast amounts of knowledge that the speakers who've presented thus far and those who are coming to be together with you, together with all of the very deeply dedicated workers of our group. I'll single out Janet in particular. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to speak and to share together with you. You can see the blurb of the theme of my talk in the program that's been given to you, and I'd like to outline the 4 different points that I plan on discussing with you. The first point will be my experiences and challenges in a recent child abuse case that took place a number of years ago. The second will be the identification of a number of toxic theologies and bad communal practices in understanding obstacles to a child-first policy. The third point that I'd like to discuss is to suggest various policies that faith communities should adopt to protect children. And fourth and finally, 5 top lessons for faith leaders in the audience. How far must a faith leader go in order to protect children? Well, as Janet mentioned, I'm the rabbi of a large Orthodox congregation in St. Louis. When people ask me how large our congregation is, I tell them that it sleeps 400. So people come and people go. In late 2006, early 2007, one of those people who came was a man by the name of David Kramer. He was a charismatic, clean-shaven, apparently religious/Orthodox Jew who's about 45 years old. And he seemed to know quite a bit about Judaism. He was a rah-rah guy who kids were attracted to, especially the young Jewish teens in our congregation. And he would, amongst other things, lead some of the singing at the end of the prayer services. And he may have even led an unofficial group afterwards teaching the boys how to sing and how to participate in the services. He was previously married to a woman in town, and I knew that he was married to her, and he was very devoted to his wife. She had 2 children who were his stepchildren at that point. And he was with her with a tremendous amount of support as she struggled with a bout of cancer. So I saw him to be a good guy, and he had an apartment that was very near the synagogue, very near our synagogue. Well, there were suspicions that came, though, from some comments that were made by some of the members of my congregation that he was spending, David Kramer was, an inordinate amount of time with one boy in particular who was 12 years old, who was having some struggles with his father. And perhaps there was that connection because for those of us who are blessed to be parents, we know that our kids sometimes look at us as the sheriff. And when there's someone else who's a reasonable person who doesn't have that mantle of authority, so it's very easy to understand how a type of connection and attraction could be made. Well, in August of 2007, the family came to me to tell me that they believed that their son had been abused by David Kramer. So I did 4 things. The first thing that I did was that I called the government abuse hotline. The second thing was that I urged the family to contact their child's psychologist and that the child should tell the psychologist what it was that happened, and the family did that. The third thing that I did was that I urged the family to contact authorities and to support prosecution of David Kramer to the fullest extent that the law would allow. And the fourth thing that I did was, immediately upon hearing of the allegations of abuse, I met with David Kramer, and I told him that he was no longer welcome at our synagogue, and that he should have no further contact with any of the children who he had met through our synagogue. Well, it was somewhat difficult for me to have this conversation with him. It was difficult to have what was, to a degree, a confrontation, mostly because he was a likable fellow. He was likable, he was personable. But intellectually, though, it was a no-brainer, because just as I and just as faith leaders, those of you here, understand clearly that we have a religious obligation under our watch to prevent children from contracting, for example, a communicable disease, so too, I believe that all faith leaders, rabbis and others, have the identical obligation to protect our children and others from predators and abusers. And to do anything less than that would be a dereliction of the duty with which we're entrusted. So I was guided by my instincts, and I was guided by what I saw as a religious mandate to do what the right thing was. And based upon my report to the government and the report of the psychologist who called the authorities, David Kramer was arrested in August of 2007, just a few days after the reports were made, but not soon enough. And there was an interim period where I was concerned that he would escape, but for whatever reason he didn't, and then he was apprehended by the authorities. Well, in terms of reaction from the families and the individuals within the community, it was quite surprising to me, having been thrust into this position with having had no experience whatsoever in dealing with issues of abuse. There were no calls of support from anyone in the community through me to support the family. And although the family was not identified by name, but I was known, as I'll describe very publicly, as the face of this particular incident, but I didn't receive any calls of concern from any of my rabbinic colleagues or from any of the other individuals in the Orthodox Jewish community. On the contrary, I noticed, much to my surprise, that support for the perpetrator swung into high gear, and that there was support from throughout the community to get him a lawyer. There were concerns that were expressed about making sure that while he was in jail, that he would be able to have kosher food, that he would be able to meet his religious obligations. And at the trial, or at the hearing, a number of his supporters were present. And I had one confrontation with a rabbi in the community who I believe was the one who was behind raising the money for bail, and he wasn't granted bail, he was in jail, but raising money for his legal defense. And the almost total absence of support from the community for the family led the family to state to me that if they had not been so deeply embedded in the community and had children attending schools and such, that they would have left the community. They would have moved. That's how broken they were. On the other hand, I did hear from a number of other people outside of our community. I received emails because as a network of supporters for children's advocacy got wind of this story, I received a number of letters of support, not only nationally but internationally. Again, being quite surprised, thinking that this was something that was just so simple that it should be a slam dunk in the way that it should be treated. But as I came to see, apparently it wasn't quite as simple as I, the naive rabbi at the time, was not aware of. Well, in 2008, David Kramer was pled guilty to 2 counts of child molestation, sexual misconduct, and statutory sodomy on a 12-year-old boy, and he was sentenced to a prison term of 7 years. But little did I know at that point, when he went into prison, that in a sense, the story had really only just begun. During his incarceration, stories began to come my way that there was something that was much deeper beneath the surface of the David Kramer story. It turned out that 20 years before he had come to St. Louis, he was living in Australia, and with a full beard, he had taught for 3 years in a private Orthodox school from 1989 to 1992. And then from there he went, under circumstances that I'll share with you in a few moments, he went to Israel in 1992 and spent almost a decade there before he came to St. Louis in about 2003. And I later found out that he was separated from an Israeli wife and he had 11 children. Well, rumors were swirling around, and ultimately an extradition order was issued for David Kramer to be able to return to St. Louis, to be able to be taken back to Australia just before his release on parole in St. Louis. And the basis of the extradition was that there were a number of claims that had come forth from the publicity that had come out due to the case in St. Louis. There were a number of reports that came out that he, David Kramer, had fondled or otherwise indecently assaulted children in Melbourne, where he was living and working as a teacher. One former student accused him of hundreds of incidents. And in December of 2011, again, in terms of the timeline, this is very close toward the period of time that he was about to be released. He was charged in Australia for multiple counts of indecent assaults and indecent acts, and that charge in Australia was to pave the way for his extradition. So back in Australia, there was a tremendous tumult that was taking place as it emerged that there, at the time, said, my understanding is that it was prior to mandatory reporting. The school administrators and the rabbis then sent David Kramer off to Israel, not notifying the authorities in Israel. The court in Australia heard from a gentleman named Harry Cooper, who was a member of the school's executive board in Australia, and he helped to organize David Kramer to flee to Israel using the college funds. And the court reported that Cooper advised that the Yeshiva Center, that's the name of the school, was prepared to pay for his passage to Israel, and he left immediately, whisked away in the middle of the night. So, upon his release to parole in St. Louis, the Australian authorities were waiting. They apprehended him. They extradited him to Australia. Initially, David Kramer indicated that he would contest the charges that were presented against him, but ultimately he pleaded to what many consider to be a sweetheart deal. He pleaded guilty to 5 charges of indecent assault and 1 of committing an indecent act with a person under 16, and he's currently serving a sentence of just 18 months in Australia. However, the good news is that David Kramer, now 52 years old, is believed to be the first member of a Jewish institution in Australia to have admitted to sex crimes. And the victims in Australia say that his admission in St. Louis and his conviction was a watershed for the Australian Jewish community. A number of victims subsequently came forth. Abuse victim Manny Wax, who's now the director at SEDIC, an institution that I'm involved with, said that David Kramer's conviction was an important milestone for victims. He termed it a watershed moment, and that since the scandal broke, that it sent a very strong message to the community, thus encouraging and emboldening a number of victims to be able to come forth who previously had heard only silence. Another person who's the father of one of the victims said that the David Kramer case was the catalyst for the wall falling in Melbourne by David Kramer being put away. And that Manny Wax himself said that when I saw that article about David Kramer in St. Louis being apprehended, I thought that this is the right opportunity for me to come forth. Well, moving on to the second item that I'd like to discuss, the toxic theologies and bad communal practices and understanding obstacles to a child-first policy. I'll share with you 8 different items. The first is that there is an aversion to, because certain rabbis and individuals in our faith communities have authority, there is an adherence to authority. Sometimes ranging to virtual infallibility. Like, as you're familiar with in the office of the Pope, there's the power to demand complete obedience and to require secrecy in order to reserve that power. There sometimes exists almost a virtual infallibility of rabbis as well, to the point where if they tell their congregants, don't go to the police, the congregants will not go to the police. A quick story that I'll share with you that illustrates this idea. My father, Dr. Erwin Siegel, is an orthopedic surgeon in Chicago. And he treats a number of individuals in the fervently Orthodox community in Chicago. A woman once came to him with a son for some treatment, and she said that after he had proposed a certain procedure, she asked him if he could take the x-rays that he had taken to her rabbi so that the rabbi could decide which doctor would treat her son. So he said that he smiled, wondering what in the world that was about, but he said, certainly, I'll give you the x-rays. So about 3 months later, or 2 months later, she came back and she said that I've chosen you upon the advice of my rabbi that you are the doctor to treat my son. And he said, well, that's really fascinating. I'm very pleased to treat your son, but how did your rabbi decide that I'm the doctor to treat? So he said, well, it's very simple. He said he took the x-rays and he put them up and he held them up to the window, and he said that I see that Dr. Erwin Siegel is your doctor. I know of him. He's a good doctor, so let him treat your son. So in that case, at least, the system worked, but unfortunately, it often doesn't. A second obstacle to a child-first policy is that there are many individuals who are faith leaders who believe and insist on handling things internally. This desire to handle things internally, as we'll discuss, is perhaps based upon the desire to avoid, quote unquote, unnecessary things from getting out. And this belief, of course, precludes experts and outside authorities from being able to consult, and of course, that prevents the investigations, which the sooner that they're undertaken, the better from taking place. A third problem, a third toxic theology, if you will, is a concern for consequences to the family of the abused. And these are very real problems that families face. It takes a tremendous amount of courage and bravery. Such challenges as in the story that I identified and described to you, where the parents were threatened that their children and other children would be thrown out of the school if they turned to the police, that the families are afraid of being ostracized. If you're identified as being an informer, or if you're identified as being a member of a family whose family is an informer, so it gives your family a bad name to the degree that you may be ostracized and not find suitable marriage partners later on, that you'll be on a blacklist and that no one will want to marry into your family. And I think that it's very difficult for people who are not part of a closed community to appreciate how significant that concern is. There's also concerns, and this is the fourth point, of communal fears, and that bad publicity will defile not only the family name, but it will also defile the community. After all, what do people think of if they hear that our child was abused or that abuse took place in our community? To use a Yiddish word, people will say it's a shanda. Did I get that right, Joel? They'll think that it's a shanda, that it's a disgrace. So people don't want the disgrace to fall upon their name and the name of the family. And related to this is, to use a Hebrew phrase, they're concerned about what they believe would be a chilul Hashem. It'll profane God's name, not realizing, of course, that the ultimate desecration of God's name is the abuse that was covered up. A fifth problem that exists, at least in the Jewish community, and may replicate itself in other faith communities, is what's known in Hebrew as Mesira, the prohibition of handing one of our own over to the outside authorities. This is a prohibition in certain cases that certainly has an ample basis on the history, at least, of the Jewish communities in Europe and medieval Europe, where we were very, very concerned about reporting crimes to the civil authorities. But that the extension of this concept today clearly doesn't apply in most cases, certainly not in cases of domestic violence or sexual abuse, yet that there are many individuals in the community who believe that it is a betrayal to turn a Jew over to a non-Jewish court. A sixth consequence that makes it very difficult to deal with these problems in communities is a concern for the negative effects on the abuser and his family itself, because individuals feel that as an individual's being associated with the abuse, certainly his incarceration will destroy the livelihood of the family, or at least significantly harm it, that the child, or they may be concerned that the child might be removed from the family and placed in a secular institution or adopted by secular parents, and that institution may be an institution of non-Jews. So therefore, people would say, this is what's going to happen if we turn in the abuser, and we can't allow that to happen. Also, there's a concern that some people have that I alluded to earlier, that you can't take a religious Jew, an observant Jew, and you can't put him in jail. How could you do that? He's not going to be able to observe his religion by being able to keep Shabbat, by being able to have kosher food and such. I think another item, the seventh item, that presents a challenge in dealing with this in a straightforward way for all of us is that there's a tremendous cognitive dissonance that exists, a suspension of belief in finding credible charges of abuse when the alleged perpetrator is someone who presents himself or herself to be a religious person. It's something that just doesn't compute. It's something that we can't fathom, particularly if the individual is identified externally and perhaps in certain ways internally through his actions as a person who is a true God-fearing person. And if we have an individual who appears to be religious, certainly if we have a person who's a rabbi, a person who has a title, so I think that to a certain degree we all say, to ourselves about those type of things. It's not possible. He just couldn't do it. I don't want to believe that it's really true, like with sports heroes and others who have been accused and convicted of other such things. So since we believe, and I think that all of us find that to a degree, since we don't want to believe something, we find it hard to believe that it's true, that prevents us from acting in a rational fashion when the evidence is clear before us. And the eighth and final idea that I'll share with you in terms of the obstacles to a child-first policy is that there are many people, as difficult as it may be for us to believe, there are many people who believe that abuse really isn't that bad. While for most educated people consider abuse to be absolutely abhorrent, immoral, and unethical, and intolerable, there are some individuals who look at it as not being so bad to warrant the response that I and all of you advocate. There's not a recognition of the emotional harm or the long-term effects that take place from sexual abuse. And I think compatible with this is that the very word for abuse, the word abuse and molestation and other such words, these words do not exist in certain communities, in certain insular communities, that the children themselves and the adults themselves do not have the vocabulary to describe these type of things. And of course, we know that our thoughts and our beliefs are determined by the language that we use or the absence of terms to describe it. So individuals who as was spoken, I think as Dr. Jensen spoke about before, individuals with an eighth grade education or less, they don't have the ability to be able to compute these type of things. In terms of policies, what could be some suggested policies? I'll share with you 6 policies that I would suggest that faith communities adopt to best protect children. The first is criminal background checks. Criminal background checks for workers with youth and any volunteers and any contractors who come in contact with or who would have access to children. And this would include mandatory employee fingerprinting, something that's routinely done, or at least in increasing numbers. And there's no reason, in my opinion, why the same policy shouldn't exist in our faith communities. The second would be communal registries, which means that we should have a cross-disciplinary system that will bar those who have had inappropriate interactions with children within our own religious faith systems. So that certainly would have prevented someone who escaped under the cover of night in Australia and coming to St. Louis if there would have been such a system in effect. And each faith system, I think, or community would be capable to a degree of being able to implement something like that. A third policy that I think that would be very helpful is something that is done in many areas in the Jewish world, and especially now since there's been a greater awareness of a concern of child advocacy, and that is the policy of no child should be left alone. There's a term in Hebrew called yichud, from the Hebrew word echad, which means one, and that is a policy that's implemented today in Jewish youth organizations, that youth professionals, volunteers, and even older students themselves should avoid all activities and all situations that would leave a child alone with an adult. So there should always be 2 members present of the opposite gender. In this day, you don't know, maybe just be two adults under all circumstances. And it comes up even with such things as a parent driving carpool as well, driving carpool with a child who might be left alone if that child isn't his or hers. The fourth policy is that in a very general sense, I think that it's very important for every faith community to have clear what their policy of reporting abuse is. Each state, as I understand it, has its own laws regarding the responsibility of reporting suspected abuse. Each state has its own definition of who is and who is not a mandated reporter. And every faith community should understand clearly what the laws in their state are, and certainly, at least minimally, adhere to that law. Fifth, a definition of abuse, together with harassment, is something that's needed. A working definition of knowing what abuse and harassment is. And the sixth and finally, just as a general suggestion to faith leaders, to institute or to implement, if not already being done so, what I call best practices. And I'll just share with you a few examples of best practices that I would suggest that faith communities have, such as asking ourselves or our spiritual leaders the following questions. How many of you have spoken from the pulpit on this issue, specifically about the importance of calling the police or child protective services, and that it is not turning one of ours into theirs? What educational programs have you conducted for parents? What child protection policies are in place in your churches or in your synagogues? Is contact information for local abuse services displayed in a public place? And to those who are educators or involved with schools in your communities, does your school have up-to-date policies on child protection issues? And is the faculty of your school, be they individuals who are secular teachers or not, receiving regular training on these issues? Well, finally, I'd like to share with you what I've identified as 5 top lessons for faith leaders. And how far must we as faith leaders go when confronting the issue of child advocacy and abuse? The first obligation that we have, and it has been said, and I hope that it'll be repeated again, is to protect. Our first obligation is to protect. I tell people often that I understand that my job description as a rabbi is to comfort those who are agitated and to agitate those who are comfortable. So I think a number of my congregants would say I do a very good job of the latter. But be that as it may, to comfort and to protect those who are agitated, to those who are in distress, those who are not capable, for any one of a number of reasons, of being able to help themselves. If we put the concern for the safety and the welfare of our children and others who can't help themselves first and foremost, that is the primary duty and the obligation of those of us who are in the faith community. Jewish tradition says that those who are kind to those who are cruel are ultimately cruel to those who are kind. And the kindness of those who deliberately and negligently refrain from acting when they have the opportunity to report and to put away the abusers are ultimately as guilty an act of abuse as the perpetrators of the abuse itself. So therefore, it's a misplaced compassion that ultimately is an act of cruelty. And despite the fact that we may have certain sentiments that would make it hard to have these type of confrontations, that is our job description. The second lesson, I think, is zero tolerance. There's no evidence, I would suggest, based upon what I've seen and what I've read, there's no evidence that the vast majority of the faith practitioners in our congregations are anything other than faithful practitioners of their religion. And there's no evidence that they're anything other than good people. But one drop of cyanide can poison an entire bottle. And particularly if knowledge of abuse is known, but someone failed to point it out. So we have no choice as responsible faith leaders to root this out wherever it might be found, including rooting out those who knowingly expose children to predators, because it could happen again. The third idea that I'll share with you as faith leaders is that we also have to seek justice. And justice, in my opinion, is not served simply by the David Kramers going to jail and verbal apologies from the abuse enablers. Those who were responsible for the abuse that took place should be fired, and the institution should be forced to make financial compensation to the victims. And then we can say to the victims that we pursued justice on your behalf. And something that I've seen in my experience is that we can't underestimate the power of the comfort that a victim feels that if we as their advocates pursue this justice to the nth degree, because then they will feel that they're really on my side, that there's really somebody in my corner, and if not, so even if the perpetrator goes to prison, so if the community itself doesn't stand behind the victim, so then the consequences are very serious. The fourth lesson that I'll share with faith leaders is that you have to know your limits. You have to know your limits as to what it is that you know. I often tell people that as a rabbi, I'm a GP. I'm a general practitioner. I am not a specialist, and there's a lot of things that I don't know. So unless you happen to be a specialist in this area, there's not only no shame in admitting that you might be your head if you try to deal with this, but on the contrary, we really have an obligation to consult with the experts and the authorities, much like in the same way if it would be a medical issue. We would never dream, at least most responsible people, of treating it ourselves, but we would refer to a person who's an expert. And the fifth and the final idea that I'll share with you, I'll share with faith leaders, is that this is something that perhaps doesn't need to be said, but I think that it's important, and that is that we as faith leaders should have faith. We as faith leaders should have faith that if we do the right thing, that we won't lose out, that nothing bad ever happens to someone as a faith leader if you do the right thing. And to quote or to paraphrase a passage from King Solomon in the book of Ecclesiastes, he says, "Cast your bread upon the waters, because in the aftermath of many days you'll find it. And only good things can come to people who do the right thing."